to this session titled Objectivity and Subjectivity, a Quagmire. This session will look at both objectivity and subjectivity in music assessment and work to explore what we see as diverse perspectives in a new way. My name is Fred Burrack. I hold the position of Director of Assessment for Kansas State University and am the Graduate Chair for Music Education. I was co-chair in the development of the Model Cornerstone Assessments that were developed and tested to align with the United States national standards, and recently co-edited a new text for music assessment.
My name is Dorothy Thompson, and I am the Assistant Director of Academic Assessment at Auburn University in the state of Alabama. Dr. Burrack and I worked together for 3 years in the Office of Assessment at Kansas State University.
Let's begin with the notion of a quagmire. A quagmire is defined as a situation that can easily trap you in such a way that becoming involved with a problem makes it difficult to escape or resolve. How does this relate to considerations of subjectivity and objectivity? To put this into context, here are a couple quagmires. National testing services have created high-stakes tests to determine readiness for collegiate study and statistically tested for validity and reliability. It is also commonly accepted that the results have limited usefulness to confirm readiness and often misrepresent what a student knows and can do in the disciplinary areas in which it evaluates. Yet, when attempts are made to enable testing that allows for greater flexibility in response and representative of learning skills and content, we can't seem to move out of that paradigm. Now, music is a complex activity that allows for creativity, requires simultaneously processing multiple constructs that mean one thing individually and something different together. Music also results in a variety of demonstrations that can signify achievement. When I was working on the Model Cornerstone Assessments for the national standards, there was a continual request from policymakers to use this Model Cornerstone Assessments to create measures that could be standardized, going against the nature of the discipline itself. Those of us in the development team had many discussions to finally break away from standardized comparability.
The terms objectivity and subjectivity in assessment are generally understood as to either the nature of data gathered or how the data is to be perceived. When comparing approaches to assessments, sometimes the question comes up about the difference and benefits of objective versus subjective. Objectivity defines information that is collected through measuring, observing, and examining, resulting in what we come to believe are facts. In respect to how we view data, it refers to the elimination as best possible to remove preference or bias from one side or the other. Subjectivity describes information that is based on personal views, opinion, or value judgments. Being subjective includes making decisions based on preference or contextual factors. Some researchers view objectivity and subjectivity as opposites. Most believe that assessments require clear definitions of achievement and learning. What is the endpoint? What exactly should students look like? In having these clear definitions, there is danger of making subjective judgments. On the other hand, music in general requires subjectivity. So if we're trying to assess in a music class, by defining these expectations, we might be limiting our students' creativity or their expression of musicality. Some suggest that they are at either end of a continuum over which assessment and scoring methods are considered closer to one side than another. This paper addresses a conceptualization of subjectivity and objectivity associated with assessment in music education. Items considered objective that are used to measure learning often reflect the notion of a singular correct answer. In the case of greater complexity in the item tested, the methodology reflects defined patterns of response. We do this in assessment as an attempt to create measures in which scorers exercise as little judgment as possible when scoring indicators of learning. Objective tests are also often constructed with selected response item formats, such as multiple choice, matching, and true-false, in which the range of possible answers is limited to the options provided on the test. These formats can assist a teacher in understanding what students know and do not know, but this does not inform understanding of music's complexity within an assessment environment. While objective tests may have a place in music classrooms, their reach should not extend into music performance assessment. The assessment of music performance includes multiple constructs, and these multiple constructs are interacting simultaneously, and this is why objective tests fully describe the complexity of student learning in music. It is with this practice where conceptualization of objectivity becomes challenged. What we propose in this thesis is that everything that is objective has some amount of subjectivity involved, and everything subjective requires a little bit of objectivity in assessment. We should not consider them mutually exclusive, but inclusive and interdependent in assessment.
The decisions made as to which questions to ask and which responses to provide are reflective of subjective decisions during test development, as there are as many questions not asked as are included. Much of what we assess in objective assessments are interpreted by the test writer, which demonstrates the presence of subjectivity in objectively scored items. This becomes problematic with music because of the complexity involved in music learning. What often occurs is the test item ends up being the representation or indication of music learning, hindering many other options that may also indicate learning. The latent nature of music learning and the multiple ways that learning can be represented make it difficult to consider any singular response objectively as representing music learning. Of course, unless the objective of assessment is to examine the question itself. Learning is emergent and divergent. In teaching, this is extremely important to keep central in our minds, but defining expectations for learning are also essential in defining learning sequence or direction for our teaching. I've heard some consider that defining learning outcomes limits the nature of music making. If we look at learning outcomes as purely objective, then this is problematic. But it is important to recognize that outcomes can be demonstrated in multiple ways, all of which are accurate and can indicate learning attainment in music. The use of learning outcomes are the guide that we as teachers use to allow for a variety of ways students can explore and display their expression of knowledge and skills. Another consideration is that objective assessments are laced with the unfortunate results that a test taker is not allowed to supply alternative, but yet acceptable responses. Objectivity in the form of standardized response through assessment in music learning can be difficult to attain and is probably not even desirable. An answer key that specifies correct responses can easily neglect the opportunity for students to demonstrate music learning in ways that have been constructed and in the ways that they apply it, which may be different than the test taker has designed. When limited to a test item and response that a teacher or test taker created, every acceptable and reasonable creative response cannot always be anticipated. Student demonstrations of music learning should involve the opportunity for creativity and interpretation. It is reasonable and appropriate in music assessment to create tasks and task items that allow alternative responses, so to better represent how individual students authentically demonstrate the quality of learning. Here is another quagmire. We often equate objectivity with fairness. But if the process of developing objectivity limits opportunities for students to demonstrate the essence of their music learning, then the aspect of fairness is questionable. Sometimes the use of objective measures are for the purpose of scoring efficiency. An inherent problem in striving for efficiency in assessment may result in the same struggle as the attempt for objectivity, which could be neglecting opportunities for students to demonstrate learning authentic to their understanding, goals, or preferences. From a pedagogical perspective, it is prudent to be conscious of the multiple ways that students can demonstrate music learning and how multiple or alternative responses may represent that learning intent. Developing assessments that enable students to demonstrate their music learning in ways may not be efficient, but may better represent the way students experience and learn music. It is a challenge to create a scoring device that will allow for variability in response, as well as enable scorer subjectivity respecting to their background and expertise. But enabling those forms of subjectivity provide greater value to the assessment itself. Now, similar to objective measures that are designed through decisions by the test creator, it's rare to find a purely subjective evaluation in music learning, especially in music performance. To help with objectivity, criteria, as seen in this rubric, provides a set of guidelines used for clarity and focus in assessing student performance. Subjective impressions of scores are justified by the objective qualities provided in the expectations against which the scorer's judgments are made. Well-constructed rubrics provide focus for addressing important content areas while enabling freedom to consider contextual factors of the assessment task, implicit factors of the performer, multiple means for students to address the expectations, and interaction with social and cultural norms that may impact how students demonstrate learning. Sometimes we have to be careful in rubric design not to develop constrictive objective constraints that will hinder that acceptance of variability necessary for music assessments, or, on the contrary, providing too little guidance to structure assessment decisions. Many teachers use rubrics for a variety of reasons, including they make grading fair and balanced. They make grading easier. They give students clear information about what the instructor expects, and they eliminate mystery or arbitrariness or bias. Every content choice made in the construction becomes part of an objective framework, and yet can provide freedom that allows students to demonstrate learning that represents their unique understanding. This slide's an example that is designed to empower subjective decisions while embracing objective guidance. You see 5 criteria assessed in one model cornerstone assessment. These were designed to assess the multiple ways that students could demonstrate music learning through musical processes of creating, performing, or responding. These criteria came from a proficient level of the performing process. The model cornerstone assessment rubrics were then to produce an independent score for each criteria that was appropriate for the assessed task. These scoring devices score individual process criteria similar to the national standards. They're designed to relevantly apply nearly any way a student desires to demonstrate the musical process. Each level of criteria used wordings that are ubiquitous to apply any assessment task used by music teachers or demonstrate learning exhibited by students. By that, we mean the students can demonstrate their proficiency in the unique ways which may be different than another student, but still demonstrate the levels of achievement that define each of those assessment categories. In the development of these assessments, we need to inspect our own objectivity so it would not conflict with subjectivity necessary for the variability of student response. Music assessment must transcend our perspectives to allow our students' musical learning to be creative, interpretive, and musical. Whether it be through a rubric or other forms of assessment tools, subjectivity is an essential component of making objectivity useful in music assessment. Objectivity enables those who design assessments to provide clear information about expectations, while subjective considerations allow students to frame their musical learning in unique ways that can authentically represent the learning that has occurred. Now, objectivity in the design of assessments for music learning offer a framework within which students can fit their work as long as it does not constrict opportunities for creative and expressive musical response that's unique to each student. It's impossible and impractical, or maybe better stated, inauthentic, to consider that an assessment measure will precisely address all possibilities that indicate learning has occurred. So for music assessments to be effective and useful, measures of learning should focus more on authenticity for how students represent learning, allowing for variability within a margin of homogeneity, with a lowered concern of the traditional views of objectivity and subjectivity. One single objective decision is founded upon subjective considerations. I believe we need to move beyond the idea of objective versus subjective and the notion that they don't exist simultaneously. In assessment development, we need to make sure there's sufficient subjectivity allowable in the task, and measure adequately infers the qualities of student learning, which is the objective component. In order to provide indicators of student learning that embrace the complexity of student learning in music, assessments must include and must be used to continually inform and adjust teaching and learning practices. Many times, objective measures are used because of efficiency in evaluation, but assessments must inform by providing a thorough picture of student learning in the ways that students construct and represent learning, not in the way that a test constructor constructed and represents learning. We need targets to guide our teaching, but we also need targets to explore what's beyond that target. It's important to consider the multiple ways that students can hit the target of learning outcomes, and that learning can go beyond in multiple ways. this is how we move beyond this quagmire, is to stop looking at objectivity and subjectivity as two separate ends of a continuum, but to look at objectivity and subjectivity as two essential components in the assessment process, and they both need to be involved to find assessment data useful for in identifying student learning. That when we're looking at one end or the other, we will be missing some very important information that will help us indicate the learning that has occurred in music. If you'd like for further discussion or questions, feel free to email. Thank you very much for listening.